Hey everybody, and welcome to Minion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Minion. This is a 5-cost action and attack card from Intrigue, and it says +1 action, choose 2 coins, or discard your hand, +4 cards, and each other player with at least 5 cards in hand discards their hand and draws 4 cards. So that's quite a large mouthful for that second option. Just to be clear, you always get +1 action, and then the choice is between either 2 coins or between discarding your hand and drawing and getting off this discard attack on your opponent. That might just make it a little bit simpler to understand what's going on with this card's text. So when we look at Minion at a basic glance, it looks like a non-terminal +4 cards with an attack on top of that costs 5. Now, comparing that to other 5-cost cards, we have cards like Laboratory, which are non-terminal draw at 5, but they only draw +2 cards. And we've got terminal, like Smithy variants that cost 5, and they only draw 3 cards. So given that non-terminal draw is pretty good, and +4 cards is incredibly good for the price as well, and attacks on top of that also tend to be quite nice. But this card, at a first glance, must seem pretty crazy, right? Not only are you getting it non-terminally draw, but you're getting stronger non-terminal draw for that price point than you normally do, with this bonus attack on top. So what's the catch? How can this card have so many seemingly very, very powerful stats on it? And the catch is that it forces you to discard your hand anytime you want to play it for draw. So what does that mean for us? What's the impact? Well, if you've watched my game analyses for random boards that come at the end of every video, particularly the last one on the video for Mill, you may have heard me refer to Minion as a draw to X card when I'm assessing the board. Now, technically, Minion isn't a draw to X card. So when you look at a card like Library, it says that you draw until you have so many cards in hand. And so you draw more cards if your hand size is smaller. That's why we call it draw to X. Minion, on the other hand, will always draw you 4 cards, regardless of your current hand size when you play it. But the reason why I consider it a draw to X card, or at least some sort of variant of that, is that the way that you tend to build your deck when you are using Minion as your main draw tends to be pretty similar to how you would construct a draw to X deck. So I use this as sort of a shorthand to sort of get a sort of understanding of what I'm trying to do on the board that I'm about to play by treating it as draw to X. And I find that cards that synergize with draw to X, for the most part, tend to synergize with Minion as well. So it's sort of almost in a way a bit of a mental shortcut to help me understand a lot more quickly what's going on the board. It does have some differences, and so that's important. Minion is a fairly unique card in the way that you draw through your deck when you're using it. But, for the most part, there are these similarities that we can take advantage of. So we're just going to go through some of these similarities. So one of the main things with draw to X is that you are looking to essentially play your payload as action cards when you are in the middle of drawing your deck. So in a traditional, for example, Village and Smithy draw engine, what you're looking to do is try and play all your villages and smithies first, get all of your cards in your hand, and then you start playing your payload. So stuff like your bridges or your artisans or whatever it is that you might need to do. In draw to X, you're specifically looking to play them in the middle of the turn so that you get them out of your hand so that you can keep drawing more. If you can't play any payload that you draw in the middle of your turn, then what that means is that when you play your next library, that card is still in your hand and you're going to draw a little bit less. Well, with Minion, if you don't play your payload when you draw it, it's going to get discarded out of your hand and you're actually going to miss your opportunity to play with it at all. So it's a little bit harsher in that regard. But Minion is non-terminal, so you're not having to spend actions on the draw itself, which frees up some actions to play your payload. Now, cards that discard, draw to X likes those because they get bad cards that are clogging up your hand out of your hand so that you can draw more in their place. In Minion, on the other hand, because you're going to be discarding the cards anyway, it sometimes doesn't really matter if you are being forced to discard cards out of your hand. So cards like Mill, for example, you can support them pretty easily with Minion because the cards that you discard with your Mill, you probably weren't going to be playing anyway. They were going to get discarded as it was, so the whole discarding thing doesn't really hurt you because it was going to happen anyway. So discarders work really well with Minion in the way that they do with Draw to X cards. And Minion does not really like treasures, so the problem in Draw to X is that you can't really have that many treasures in your deck because they sit in your hand and you can't play them until the end of your action phase once you've finished. So they will, as soon as you draw one, it will tend to sit in your hand and basically clog up a space that makes all future Draw to X you play that turn less effective. So you try to avoid them, but you might have one or two in a Draw to X deck like Library. Minion handles treasures even worse than Draw to X, and that is because you can't play them at all most of the time unless you just so happen to have them in your hand once you've finished playing your action cards, which can be really unlikely. So Minion is really, really bad with treasures. Very occasionally you get the cards that allow you to play treasures in the middle of your action phase, like Black Market or Villa, where you actually return to your action phase. But for the most part, treasures and Minion do not play nicely at all. Like you will just be discarding the treasures out of your hand, and you never get to play them. So cards like Counterfeit for your trashing, when you draw your Counterfeit, when you are trying to draw with Minion, you might actually have to either just say, okay, I can't draw anymore because I really want to play this Counterfeit to trash treasures, or you might have to just give up on playing that Counterfeit this turn, right? You just may not get the opportunity. So it can be very, very unreliable when you are playing with treasures with Minion. I wouldn't really recommend it most of the time. Now, one difference between Draw to X, and this is an important one, is action stock cards. So the thing with Draw to X is that they like cards like Festival because every action stock card that you are playing is taking a card out of your hand and you get to draw more. Now, essentially, it's not so much drawing more, I guess, as it is that Library makes up for the fact that that was a stock card by drawing something else in its place. In the case with Minion, this is not so, because you're always going to be drawing 4 cards, no matter what. So Minion is a lot happier with things like cantrip coins than they are with things like festivals. And, you can still have a load of festivals in a deck that draws with Minion, because drawing 4 cards every play is kind of a lot. But bear in mind that you're not getting quite the same sort of synergy as you are with cards like Library. Minion prefers like cantrip coins a little bit more than your traditional like Draw to X engine would. But it's still strong draw Minion, so you can still get away with them. But just bear in mind that there is actually a functional difference in this case. Just this is a bit where the analogy breaks down a little bit. Minion's not exactly the same as regular Draw to X. Now, Minion's got real big problems with deck ordering. So most decks that you have are going to be somewhat reliant on trying to draw cards in a particular order. So I know I always use this as an example, but you think about the Village Smithy engine. You got to play villages first, and then you want to be playing your draw. And in the ideal deck layout, all of your villages will be at the top of your deck, and all of your smithies will be in the middle, and then all of your payload will come at the end. And it's not actually going to work like that in practice, and this is where the concepts of reliability and probability of drawing your deck and all that come into place. Well, Minion's got real big problems with deck ordering. It sort of exacerbates the problem of deck ordering. Now, Minion itself doesn't rely on anything else like Smithy does. You don't need to be playing villages first. As long as you get a Minion, you can keep drawing, and that's good. But cards that rely on having another card in your hand really struggle when you are playing with Minions. So when you think of a card like Remodel, it might be that you want to be matching your Remodel with one of your estates, say, for example. And the problem that Minion has is that if those 2 cards are not right next to each other in the draw order, your Remodel is very unlikely to be drawn with your estate. And in the case of a card like Library, you can just say, okay, I'm just going to hold on to the remodel until I find the estate. But with Minion, that remodel gets thrown away, it gets discarded, and so you miss your opportunity to play it. Given another example of treasure map, which very specifically needs to be drawn with another treasure map to actually do anything at all. So you're sort of only seeing a very small part of your deck at any given time. You keep this very low hand size throughout, and you've sort of got to just take what you're given. So you would try to design your deck in such a way that you don't really want to be matching other cards in your deck together. So cards like Remodel are going to get a little bit worse with Minion. You're really going to struggle to play them at the right time compared to other forms of draw. Now, there is more to it than this. So when I said that Minion doesn't really need to worry about, drawing a village to keep drawing, one of the problems is if you've got payload that is terminal, you can't play that unless you happen to have already played a village. So think about a card like Bridge. Let's say that you're playing minions, you're discarding your hand to try and play as many bridges as possible. Well, the problem is that you've got to have villages come before the bridges, because if you start with some bridges in hand and no villages, you're forced to discard the bridges away before the villages came up, and then you basically never got the chance to play that bridge. So you're not just putting up with, I'll just draw slightly less on my next library play until I have enough spare actions to play one of these bridges. You actually lose the chance to play it completely, and that can mean that your actual outcome of your turn can vary quite wildly based on what you actually got the opportunity to play or not. So there's this extra big random element that comes into it. So one of the things with Minion is that because you've got this ordering issue with villages and trying to play any sort of terminal payload mid-turn, Minion really likes it when what you're trying to achieve in your deck is also coming from non-terminal action cards. Now, Minion itself can also be played as a non-terminal 2 coins, which is sort of a non-terminal action payload card. So what this means is that Minion always has some form of non-terminal action available to it when you are playing a board that has access to Minion, and it self-synergizes with itself. The more minions that you have, eventually you will start reliably drawing 4-card hands that have 2 or possibly 3 minions in them if you've got a high enough density of minions. And what that means is that if you had, say, 3 minions in your hand, 2 of them could be played for money, and then the last one you play to draw your deck. And so if you can get enough minions, you sort of end up in this situation where the minions are not only giving you the draw, but they're also giving you the payload as well. So there's this strong self-synergy with Minion. And this leads to something that I have previously referred to as the Minion stack. So this is sort of a deck archetype in a way, where the aim is to just get as many minions as possible. And the whole aim of your entire strategy is to just generate enough money to get to province by hoping you can play 4 minions, each for 2 money. So you want to get a real high density of minions so that your odds of drawing multiple copies of Minion into each hand goes up as much as possible. And of course you need a lot of minions to do this as well. The more cards you have in your deck, the more of the minions you're going to need to spend on draw. So you're going to need quite a lot of minions so that you've actually got enough left over to play them as money. And in these sorts of decks, Minion becomes the most important card because it's sort of doing most of what you want. Maybe you've got some sort of trash card in there, but otherwise, what else do you really need? All you need is just as many minions as possible. So Minion is a card that sort of becomes stronger the more of them you have, sort of like how Bridge gets better the more of them, like each bridge that you play sort of benefits every other bridge. Minion is a card that the more of them you've got, like the overall strength of Minion goes up because you start getting this multi-purpose use for Minion, and it starts becoming everything you need in your deck is just a lot of minions. So I actually had a game once that I played online with someone, a fairly new player, I assume, and they lamented in the game I was just buying a load of minions, and they said, "Oh, I don't like to buy Minion. I think it's a lame, cheap card." They don't mean cheap as in not expensive. They mean cheap as in it's a lame tactic to play in a way, And I said to them, well, the problem with that line of thinking is that if you intentionally choose not to buy any minions, then you sort of make the problem of Minion being this all-encompassing card even worse, because Minion gets better the more of them in your deck that you have. So by intentionally trying to avoid playing with Minion, what that player would have found was that he just had more and more games he came across where his opponent crushed him by buying all 10 minions, because they just got to build a deck that really quickly got up to speed just because they had so many minions. Now, sometimes with Minion, what you want to do is you want to try and see if you can get through your deck a second time. So because of the deck ordering problems, you can have this situation where some really important card you didn't get to play the first time you saw it. So you might think to yourself, okay, I would really like to try and go through my deck a second time to find it now that I've got all of the spare actions. You can do this, but depending on how much stuff you discarded, it can be quite risky. You can cause some very, very bad shuffles if you fail to draw all the way through your deck a second time, because through the first run through your deck, you will be expecting to be playing like a lot of minions and, say, a lot of villages, and so you can end up with this discard pile that is full of nothing but junk and maybe like one or two payload cards. And if you shuffle that into a new shuffle and then something goes wrong with the draw, well, all of your minions and all of your villages are all going to go into their own discard pile at the end of the turn, and now you've got this draw pile full of all of these junk cards that you just wanted to discard all of the time. So you've got to be real careful if you decide to do this. Sometimes it's going to be better to just write off the fact that you didn't get to play one of your key cards that turn. It's going to depend on what the key card is, of course. If you do want to try this and say to yourself, okay, I'm going to go through my deck a second time, then you should try and recognise as soon as possible that this is something that you're going to want to do, so that you can choose to not play minions for money on your first run through. So sometimes it can feel a little bit automatic that when you draw multiple minions, you're going to play a bunch of them for money, and then the last one is always draw. But you might be better off just not playing those duplicate minions you drew in your hand, so that those minions get put into the discard pile. That way, when you shuffle your discard pile for another run through, you've actually got a bunch of minions in there, and hopefully that increases the reliability and odds that you're actually going to get through that second shuffle and not cause a bad shuffle for you. But bear in mind that if you do this, you're actually foregoing, of course, generating the money with those minions. So you are just going to have a much lower income turn this turn. So whatever it is that you're trying to get to play a second time, it better be worth it. Otherwise, what have you really achieved on your turn? Like, you drew through your deck twice, but you didn't have anything to show for it. Like, you got to watch out for doing that. Sometimes just constantly drawing over and over again, maybe there's a time when you should think, actually, I'm just going to stop and I'm just going to write off actually playing certain cards this turn. Like, the place where I've got to now is fine, and you have to consider that with Minion. Bear in mind that due to the attack, what you can find is that key cards get discarded really early on through no choice of your own. You drew them into your starting hand, and then your opponent's minion forced you to discard it. So that can be a reason to want to try and run through your shuffle another time to get to that card that you never had the opportunity to do anything with. Or you can just build your deck understanding that this is just what happens in Minion games and not attempt this. But if you do want to attempt it, this is what you need to do. So we've spoken a lot about the draw. Let's talk a little bit more about the attack. So this also happens when you choose the draw option with Minion. So what it essentially does is it turns your opponent's random 5-card starting hand into a random 4-card starting hand. Now, if they had a 5-card hand and you asked them to discard one card of their choice from it, they're still going to end up with a pretty good hand. Asking instead for them to draw 4 cards at random is usually going to be a little bit worse than that. But typically I would say that it's weaker than, say, Militia's attack, which asks them to choose to discard down to 3, just because 3 cards really isn't very many. Minion's attack isn't necessarily going to do that much. It all depends, but, it's not nothing, particularly if you're going for some sort of like big money, treasure-based deck. Having Minion attack turn you from a 5-card hand to a 4-card hand can really matter, because in those sorts of decks, getting up to 8, the more cards you have in your hand, the better, and just losing 1 actually really restricts quite a lot how you get to 8. The sort of card combos that you're allowed to have in your hand get very severely restricted for every card that you lose out of that hand. It can also counter ways that their opponents can try to set up their next turn. So certain ways of carrying cards into your next hand or top decking cards for your next turn, these sort of get destroyed by Minion. So typically anything that's not being done via a duration card is going to be susceptible to this. So for example, the event save lets you take a card from your hand in your buy phase and essentially add it to your hand next turn. So you're going to start, or at the end of your turn, you draw 5 and then you immediately add the card to it. So you have this 6-card hand awaiting between turns. Well, if they attack you with Minion, all 6 of those cards are getting discarded and you draw another random 4. So it wastes that completely. Similarly with Flag Bearer, if you have the flag, you're going to go up to 6 cards in hand when you draw at the end of your turn. And if your opponent has a Minion, then having the flag sort of doesn't really matter, because they're just going to discard your 6-card hand and go down to 4. Because you don't draw the extra card at the start of your turn, you sit with it between turns. It's the stuff where you sit with extra cards between turns that gets walloped by Minion. There's one way that you can deal with Minion's attack is to have your own minions. So Minion, when you build a deck around Minion, you're sort of expecting that you're constantly going to have 4 cards in hand, because every time you draw with Minion, you end up with 4 cards in hand. So trying to build a deck that is able to deal with only having 4 cards to kick off every turn, you have to build your deck like that anyway when you're building with Minion. So it shouldn't be a big deal, right? In a way, it kind of counters Minion's attack, because you're kind of expecting to just have these random 4-card hands anyway when you are drawing with Minion. More traditional draw, like Village Smithy, can be a little bit harder because you need both a village and a draw card in your starting hand, whereas with Minion, you only need 1 Minion to keep going. So, it's easier to kick off with smaller hand sizes with Minion, because 1 is all you need to keep your turn continuing. And now there is one more option, of course, on the card, and that is that you can use Minion as just +1 action and +2 coins. So we talked a little bit about how this is good when you have a lot of minions in your deck. You can use this every time you have duplicate Minion in your hand. But sometimes you might want to buy a Minion just to play it for money. Well, what sort of situations might you want to do that in? Well, Draw 2X actually likes what we call disappearing money, which is some action card that is like a stop card that generates money, and you play it from your hand mid-turn and then it disappears. Now, because Minion itself sort of acts like Draw 2X, Minion tends to be a pretty good Draw 2X card when it's on the board, so you might actually forego playing stuff like Library when you've got Minion anyway. So you don't see it with other forms of Draw 2X that often, but you will sometimes. Sometimes you have decks that want to go entirely treasureless, which is something that you usually want to do with Minion, but there might be even better cards that encourage you to do that. So Scrying Pool and going for what we call a double tactician deck, those are decks that really don't want any treasure at all. And Minion can be a really good way to generate your money in those decks. Like, what codifies these is the fact that they are very good other forms of draw that sort of improve by not having any treasure. In that sort of case, you don't really want to use Minion for its draw, so you are happy to use it just for money. And lastly, if both players are going for minion stacks, you may find that the minions are very hotly contested. And what can happen in this situation is that, say, you both end up with only 5 minions. 5 minions may not actually be enough minions to properly do what you want to do. Like, it may be enough minions to actually draw through your deck, but it's not enough to actually play other minions for money, and in which case now what is your deck actually trying to do? If you have a deck where getting 10 minions means that basically you're guaranteed to win, it can be the case that in such a board, 5 minions just means that you have this non-functional deck that's got 5 minions in it, and you can't really do much with them. Well, in that sort of case, you may decide, okay, now I've got these minions, I've stopped my opponent from crushing me with a massive minion stack, but I don't really want to draw with these because I want to be playing all these other terminal cards instead. And in that case, you probably might just shift over to using minions, mainly for money. But bear in mind that Minion, as a 5-cost card, using it just as a silver equivalent that costs 5 is pretty expensive for a card that's just doing that. So usually you don't tend to buy Minion just because you need a silver, right? Normally there's usually something really good that you would want for 5 in a case like that. Now I'd just like to go through a number of notable interactions with Minion. So I wouldn't really say any of these things I'm going to talk about are necessarily combos, but they are things that play interestingly with Minion. So Throne Room and its variants with Minion. When you play Minion twice, what you might want to do is choose to discard first. That way, on the second play of Minion, you get to take a look at what new hand you've drawn, with the 4 cards you've just drawn, and then you get the option to draw again instead of taking money. So say you had a hand that was Throne Room and 2 minions and some other 4th card we don't care about. You might decide to, play Throne Room on the first minion, take money twice, and then play the last minion for draw. But what you might be better off doing is playing the first minion for money, then using the Throne Room on the second minion, discarding first, and then choosing what you want to do with the second play based on the new information that you have from the new cards. So that's a better way to play with Throne Room and its variants when you've got Minion. Minion is also an attack card that you play very many copies of when you're going for a minion stack, and it counts as an attack card even if you play it only for the money. You do not actually have to exercise the attack for it to count as having played an attack card. Well, why does that matter? Well, Soldier, which is one of the travellers that comes off of the Peasant from Adventures expansion, it earns you 1 coin for every attack card you have played that turn, or it earns you an extra coin. So when you are drawing with Minion, you are going to naturally play a whole bunch of attack cards, and this means that Soldiers will generate you huge amounts of money. Now, of course, because Soldier is a terminal payload, it suffers from these ordering issues that Minion tends to suffer from, so it might be a very wildly inconsistent amount of money between turns. But bear in mind that you could play 1 Soldier and get 8 coins from it on its own. This is not unheard of in a Minion deck. It generate you enormous amounts of cash, and of course you have Peasant available if you need buy as well. So Soldier, or more specifically Peasant and Minion, can be pretty good sometimes, as long as you've got some villages as well. Something that may matter is that Moat, as a reaction card to defend against attacks, you actually have to reveal the Moat before any of the text on the attack card is actually executed. So when you play a Minion, you announce to the players, I've played a Minion, and they actually have to choose, or they have to reveal the Moat before you, the Minion player, actually choose which option you're taking. So this could matter if you've decided that, would I be better off getting 2 money or an attack? and you don't really know, you're only going to draw with the minion just to get off the attack. And if your opponent reveals a moat, you can be like, okay, the attack is pointless, so I'm just going to go for the safe play, which is to generate money from it. Like, I don't know, that might come up sometimes, so just be aware. Council Room. People look at the card Council Room with Minion, and frequently, like, new players might say, so Council Room draws your opponent's cards, and the Minion attack discards down. So in much the way that Militia tends to undo some of the effect of Council Room, does Minion also undo the effect of Council Room? And the reality is, yes, it does. The thing is, though, is that you tend not to want to play other forms of draw with Minion, because if you play that Council Room early, and then you discard with another Minion, which you have to do to actually get the attack off, all of those cards that you drew might have gone to waste. Council Room can still be used as a plus buy, and it can be a plus buy where you don't have to worry about the extra draw for your opponent because you're using Minion. But bear in mind that you've just paid 5 for a terminal source of plus buy, and the draw was a little bit helpful, but it's not necessarily super great. Like, just because Minion and Council Room are both on the board, that the way that Minion is a discard attack might not actually encourage me to go down the Council Room and use Council Room for my buy in the way that, say, the presence of Militia would. If Militia's on the board, then Council Room, it's really easy to draw a lot and undo the advantage it gives your opponent. But Minion, maybe not so much. Like, you can still do it, but it's not so great. And lastly, just to reiterate here, you can use Minion just as the source of disappearing money for other draw to X, but it's pretty expensive just if you want to do that. So that's something that I just mentioned earlier, but here it is again. And that's it for Minion. That's quite a long explanation, but there's a lot to go here because it's a very unique card and there's not much like it. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go over to the online client and we are going to generate some random boards that include Minion, and we're going to assess what sort of impact Minion has on these boards. So here we have lots of different types of draw, it seems. We've got Steward, we've got Council Room, we've got Minion. We have Mining Village and Festival, both as villages. We have Steward for trashing. There's also Workshop Gardens, I notice. We've got Poacher as well. We've got Lurker. What would we do on this board? So I think we can beat Workshop Gardens. We seem to have all of the things that we need for some other kind of deck. So we have money and buys coming from Festival and Poacher and Council Room. They've got these important things. We've got Lurkers that we can play. The thing with Council Room as our form of draw is that, you have got playing a Minion to discard. You have got, I think Minion's probably going to be better here. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to open with Steward. And maybe I even go 2 Stewards, or I get like Mining Village, Poacher and Steward, sorry. I think I like Minion as my main source of draw just because it feels a little bit better with Lurkers and Festivals. Maybe it's not. Maybe... So this is a deck where there is nothing in here that really requires me to, pair up some cards with others. I've got a lot of ways to gain... Well, I've got Workshop to gain regular villages, so that actually makes it very easy to buy Council Room. I actually thinking about it, because I've got Workshop to get mining villages very easily, I can draw a lot faster with Council Room, and I think my hand will feel a lot better just having a big hand size rather than the inconsistencies of Minion. But, what's my payload going to be? Well, generally it's probably going to be Festivals and Poachers. But if I go Council Room, then I also have the option to just go for gold, which might be a bit more efficient. Like, instead of paying 5 for 2 coins, I can play 6 for 3, and I actually might end up with a better deck at the end. But I can't do that if I'm looking to just draw with Council Room and then play one minion just to discard my opponent's hand. So maybe that doesn't work as well. The thing with buying a lot of minions is that if I'm uncontested, now I have a load of ways to generate money anyway, and I'm probably going to want to get some festivals anyway, so I think that sort of pushes me towards just going for minion, actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to trash very quickly. Would I open like Steward, Workshop, and maybe get the chance to get some poachers early on? I do want to get a load of minions, and it would be nice to have lurkers to start getting minions, but I don't really need to open with lurker. So I think, I'm just wondering, would I go double Steward, or would I go Steward and poacher? I think Workshop and Steward are the only terminal actions I'm going to have, because the only other one, a Council Room, I'm not going to have that. So I don't really care for getting like a village early. I will find times to pick up lurkers eventually, especially if I'm going to maybe get some festivals at some point. So I'm not totally sure what I would open here. Maybe it's just Poacher and Steward. I think that might be better, actually. Just Poacher and Steward, and I'll look to get some. Maybe I do end up trashing very quickly with Steward. Maybe I'll get a second Steward, and then I'll just get Lurkers to start gaining a load of minions. But I think Minion is going to be the first pile that empties here. It's going to be the highest priority card after Steward. That's I think you get Steward first, and then you just want as many minions as possible. And if you manage to win the minion split, then you've sort of got an edge on your opponent in terms of cards for payload. You have more payload than your opponent, and your draw is a little bit more consistent late game as well. So this is a minion stack board, and minion is very important here, and we're going to be using it for our main source of draw. So straight away I notice that there's no village. We do have chapel. Because there is no village, like torture is not really going to work. Replace doesn't feel like it has anything to replace. Is there any plus buy at all? There is not. So that's important. There's no gainer at all. There is not. Okay, yikes. So what are we doing here? Are we chapeling down? I don't think I can get merchants quick enough, so I think this is again just a pure minion stack. It's just chapel and minion, and that's all we have to do, really. And then, once you've done that, so I'm going to open chapel, and maybe I just open with a silver. Maybe I open chapel and moneylender just to try and hit 5 early, and eventually I just trash the moneylender, and I just avoid getting silver. Maybe I do that. Moneylender chapel is a pretty unusual opening. I will, of course, always prioritise chapel over moneylender if I draw them together. Maybe I do that. And I look to just start getting minions and then more minions. Maybe I do need a silver, actually, because thinking about it at some point. Like, do you just trash once with chapel and then you swap over to using minions? Or using moneylenders every turn? I don't know. Eventually, at some point, I will just finish cleaning up with chapel and I'll trash the moneylender. Yeah, I just want all the minions, and if we split the minions 5-5, we'll have a really thin deck. But maybe... could you really use merchants in their place? I'm not sure that merchant would work. It's going to be very, very hard to end your turn by playing a silver. But maybe what happens is that if you have to go minion, and if it's starting to not work out because you've emptied the minion pile and you don't have enough, you actually do think about just trying to play merchants anyway, and you draw with minions until you find the silver, and then you just kind of hope that you've played a bunch of merchants, and minion is just sort of a little bit more efficient than buying merchants. I don't think upgrade or torturer or replace feel like they're going to be that useful. Maybe I get a replace at some point and I start milling provinces to start cursing my opponent. I could actually see you doing that when the minions run out. So maybe that's what I do, but that's late. I don't actually need the replace until quite late. I guess I could turn the chapel into a merchant or something, but maybe I want the chapel to get rid of the curses. I guess if they curse me, I'm just turning curses into estates or something. I don't know. But yeah, I think Minion again is a very important card here, and it's going to be, again, the first pile that empties, and it's going to be the main focus. So what do we have here? Well, we've got Steward for trashing again. We've also got Moneylender for trashing again. And this time, other forms of draw include Patrol, with Mining Village and Nobles as action support. And we also have Wishing Well as well. Well, I don't think there's anything that really combos with Wishing Well here, not that I can see. But something that is very important, Patrol and Nobles, while it is quite expensive, is pretty good because Nobles gets drawn more by Patrol. So you can use Patrol and Nobles as an additional way to draw a lot of cards. And because we have Courtier, now Courtier, there is Nobles, there is Bandit, there is Minion as cards that give you 2. Courtier is giving us a buy, and it's also letting us gain golds. We don't really need Bandit because we've got Courtier, and I think therefore going Patrol and Nobles is actually going to be better because we can draw a lot with these cards, and maybe we get some mining villages as well. And then, we can draw with the Steward that we have in our deck too. We can use buys initially with Courtier, and we can start gaining golds to get quite a lot of payload without having to buy it like we do when we have Minion. So I think not going for Minion is better here. I think Patrol, Nobles, Mining Village, Steward, this is a much better way to draw our deck, these 4 cards, because it's going to be pretty efficient and it lets us gain a lot of payload using Courtier without having to buy it all. And that means that we're just suddenly going to start, our deck's going to start getting really good very quickly. So I think the Minion stack loses out here. I don't think it's faster than these. I think it's pretty easy to buy these cards. You will miss 5 sometimes trying to buy a lot of minions, and it's nice that this other deck can support Mining Villages and Stewards and Wishing Wells when they miss otherwise. So, yeah, I think Minion has no place. I don't think the attack is very useful on this board because the rest of the draw feels pretty decent, and you've got pretty good trashing, so I think your hands are going to be very reliable anyway. So I think I skip Minion here. I don't think I'm ever actually going to get one. What's the case here? So we have Throne Room and Festival as villages. We have Masquerade to trash and Trading Post and Remodel. Well, I really like Masquerade. What have we got? We've got Torturer for draw. We have Minion for draw. Well, Torturer's really strong. So the attack for Minion, while it sort of stinks with Torturer, in reality, I think Torturer is just way better of an attack. I think it's really important that we try and play a lot of Torturers here. So what we're going to do is we're going to open with Masquerade, and we're going to open with, maybe I open with Remodel as well, honestly. So I might get a chance to turn some estates into throne rooms or something like that. And we're eventually going to want to trash a lot with Masquerade and draw massively with Torturer. We want to play a Torturer chain, and we just want to curse our opponent to death. Now, the thing is that if our opponent goes for Minion, then what they can do is, they can discard their 5-card hand down to 1 card, which is 1 Minion, and then they can draw the rest. So they get sort of like 2 free discards with Torturer, except in this particular case we have Masquerade, and the Masquerade sort of stops them from doing that, because if they're going to try and do that, well, we can pinch the Minion out of their hand and replace it with like a copper or a curse or something, and that would destroy our opponent. And the Minion really doesn't like having the curses, and it doesn't know how to deal with it. Like, Minion's got a big problem in that it keeps discarding the curses, and it can't actually get a way to trash them cleanly, as drawing a big hand size does. So I think that Minion doesn't work here. I think that the combination of Torturer and Masquerade, along with cards like Baron and Remodel as payload that want you to have a large hand size and connect cards together, means that Minion cannot compete. The Torturer stack is too strong combined with everything else on the board. And so I think the only card here that's not really that useful is Trading Post. I can imagine that we at some point get most of these cards. Maybe we don't get a Poacher, but Conspirator seems pretty good. Throne Room's pretty good. Festival's pretty good. Torturer, the Masquerade, possibly a Baron, maybe a remodel as well. What would we be remodeling? We might get the opportunity to remodel stuff, but really the Torturer chain's really important here. And it, combined with Masquerade, is just going to be a real problem for our Minion player. So Minion is skipped on this board for much better forms of draw and much stronger attacks. Here comes the last kingdom. So straight away my eye is drawn to Chapel, very strong trashing. We also have Sentry. We have Laboratory as a form of draw. We have Minion, we have Market. There is Harem as treasure, but we don't really care. I can't imagine I'm doing Patrol Harem as a deck. What's critical here is that there is no village. So what are our terminals? We've got Patrol, Moat, Bureaucrat, Chapel. I think what we're doing is we're using Chapel to trash down really quickly. We're going to use Lurkers, and we're going to get a bunch of markets. I think we could then get a bunch of minions. Like, you can get labs, you can get minions. I think it doesn't really matter here. What is important is that we do want as much money as we can get to go with markets and buys, and Minion is going to be our source of money. So I think that we are going to get as many of these two cards as we can, and while we will be playing some minions for draw, most of them are going to be played for money. You know, we can only play so many until we run out of cards in our hand, and then we have to actually draw with a minion. Maybe late we shift into getting some laboratories, but we can get a whole bunch of these. We have Lurkers to help us get them, and our main deck is just going to be playing a load of markets, playing a load of minions, getting a bunch of money until we feel the need, I guess, to start picking up provinces. And I don't see any deck that's going to help with that. We don't care if our opponent plays Bureaucrat. Patrol, Harem. How good is that? Maybe it struggles a little bit if we're playing Minion and we're attacking our opponent, but not really, honestly. Patrol is actually okay as a big money card, because that's the other strategy we do here. It's just big money, and it's big money with Patrol and Harem, and it's actually going to gain a bunch of extra points. But I think we may be able to get a functional deck that's pretty powerful a lot more quickly than we are, and I think we're going to be able to have the advantage. What's really important about the Market and Minion deck is that it has access to buys and lots of gains with Lurker in a way that the Patrol and Harem deck doesn't. So it has a lot more endgame control, and I think it wins out. Does it win out on a protracted long game? I think it does. I think it can start getting like a load of laboratories and sentries, and so it can just keep going for ages. It can gain a lot of cards with Lurker. So I think it's going to be the more powerful strategy. The attack slows this down a little bit, and while this strategy gets extra points, like the Harems are just too expensive. Really, the big money wants golds. And, yeah, well, it draws them more easily, but I don't know. I think this deck with Market, Minion, Laboratory, Lurker, Chapel is just going to be way better. So yeah, I think I do that in the long run. Like, that deck's got the higher percentage chance of winning, I think. Anyway, there you go. So that was Minion. It's essentially a form of draw. And sometimes other forms of draw are just really, really good. But a Minion, you can't deny +4 cards, and it's non-terminal, is really, really powerful. So Minion is a pretty good card, but the deck can be a little bit awkward. And it costs 5 and you need a lot of them. So sometimes it can be very difficult to just get that many. But, overall, it's a card I think either you go all in on it, or you don't really get any, because it doesn't play very nicely the discard your hand with other forms of draw at all. It sort of undoes all of the effect of drawing other cards. So, yeah, either it's going to be the best form of draw or it isn't, and so I think a lot of the time either you're going to play with Minion or you're not. And there's sort of very rarely that there is an important middle ground there. So anyway, I hope this video was useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.